everyone. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator of undergraduate research at the University of Saskatchewan. This session is being recorded as part of our SURE writing retreat. So that's the student undergraduate research experience. We're hosting a writing retreat August 11th and 12th. And with us is Jill McMillan, and she is the graduate writing specialist at the University of Saskatchewan Library. And today our style spotlight is around the concept of parallelism. And this is something that we can learn to help us all write a little bit better. And with that, Jill, I pass it over to you.
All right, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. So our focus for this 30-minute session is on the topic of parallelism. And this is just really a handy tool for us to have in our writer's toolkit so that we can ensure that we are crafting prose that is that flows, that seems organized, and that's just more appealing for our readers. So let's look at two examples, and I'd encourage you to contribute in the chat. Which of these do you prefer? So example one reads as follows. The experiment was innovative, informative, and could be run more affordably than similar tests. Example two, the experiment was innovative, informative, and more affordable when compared to similar tests. What's your initial thought? Which one do you like more? Example one or example two?
Oh.
Some preference for example two, some for example one. Okay, so it looks like we're having a bit of a split. Let's take a few more seconds and then we'll discuss. We have sort of a split preference here. And this is not unexpected. Often when I'm asking people for their preference, you'll have a range of responses, but I want to look at why one might be a bit better than the other. So when we look at example one, this is actually an example of what's known as faulty parallelism. There's a distortion in the rhythm of the sentence based on how the information has been organized. And we're going to look at that a little bit more closely. So what we have in this example is that we have initially two adjectives. So it's initially creating a nice rhythm in reading, but then that rhythm becomes interrupted when we encounter that adverb. So we go from innovative, informative, and then affordably. And it's a subtle difference, but it's enough to potentially distract your reader and pull them out of that sentence a little bit. In contrast, example two has replaced that third element with an adjective. So the experiment was innovative, informative, and more affordable. So innovative, informative, affordable, they're all adjectives. And this creates, again, it's a subtle difference, but it creates a little bit more of a potentially pleasing arrangement for your readers because of this sort of predictability in the pattern that emerges when reading. So parallelism is all about ensuring balance when writing. So we recognize that if we have these equally important elements in our sentence, we want to ensure that they are communicated through an equal grammatical construction. And this is going to help create a nice sense of rhythm and balance. So phrases or clauses that are joined by conjunctions have the same grammatical structure. So if you are incorporating phrases or clauses and you're attaching them with words such as and, or but, that is an indication that these are equal elements, and so you'll want to present them in an equal grammatical construction. There are lots of benefits to foregrounding and prioritizing parallelism when writing. So number one, it can help it to enhance readability, can help to improve rhythm, it can facilitate organization, avoid awkwardness, and lastly, creates grammatical as well as visual balance. So here is another example. How might we take this sentence, which is currently an example of faulty parallelism, and how could we rephrase it to try and make the information parallel? let's take 2 or 3 minutes in the chat. Right now it reads as the protocol is both a long procedure and very tedious. How might we revise or rephrase this sentence? I have a couple of suggestions coming in, and this is what is always so fun about writing and looking at these sort of writing puzzles together, because we recognize that actually there are usually multiple correct answers that we can identify. And so what we're seeing though is a recognition that this notion of procedure and tedious, those don't really work together, because they're not the same type of word. So we need to consider how to change this. I've seen one example where long is actually changed into a different word. It's changed into the word lengthy, for instance. And that is a possibility. I've seen examples where we're removing some words, and that's another strategy that we can use as well. I would suggest that the most concise way that we could actually rephrase this example, as well as ensure that it's going to be parallel, is to rephrase it as the protocol is long and tedious. And this is simply because the word procedure becomes a little bit redundant in the context of this sentence, because protocol and procedure might be somewhat synonymous in this context. So what we've done is we've taken an example where originally we had a noun and an adjective, so that procedure and then that sense of tedium, noun and adjective, and we've changed it to an adjective and adjective, so long and tedious. So there are lots of different common parallel structures. These are the ones that you are most likely to encounter. So adjective upon adjective upon adjective, and these sort of strings could continue forever. But if you wanted to describe a kitten as playful and silly, we are ensuring that balance because we have those adjectives together. Then we can make use of nouns and strings as well. So she likes apples, grapes, and strawberries, for instance. And then using our verbs. And our verbs can be arranged either as two verbs. So they plan to swim, to hike, and to fish during their vacation. But more commonly, you're going to encounter verbs presented in the second example of the two verb, verb, because that initial to is going to apply to all the subsequent verbs, and so we don't need to repeat it. So for instance, the government is going to ease restrictions, encourage personal responsibility, and monitor outbreaks in the coming weeks. So this might be somewhat familiar to you if you have explored the handbook for our writing retreat. But here we just have an example of how we can make use of parallelism in lists. Because often in academic writing, we are creating complex lists. And so we want to ensure that this information is going to be presented according to parallel structures. So here is our little list. Canada's Revised Food Guide focuses on 3 main food groups, including plants, fruits and vegetables, protein, nuts, meat, legumes, etc., and whole grains, oats, quinoa, buckwheat, etc. So let's break it down a little bit. So basically what we've done is we've recognized, okay, what is sort of the organizing principle here? We have a noun in each part that's referring to a broader group, so the plants, the protein, the whole grains, and then we are elaborating on it via parentheses in order to provide some more detail. But here we're also still making use of nouns. We're just providing more specific nouns: fruits and vegetables, nuts, meat, legumes, oats, quinoa, buckwheat. So this is in some ways quite a simple list, because what we're really having to balance are simply different types of nouns. But we can look at this principle in a more complicated fashion, shall we say. So here is an example that I like to use when talking about parallelism in practice. It comes from the journal Ecological Applications, and it is about worms, the European earthworm, which is an invasive species in North America. But here we see where a scientist has written up their research in a complex parallel list. So 3 broad ecological groups have been described, including epigeic species, which live and feed exclusively in the litter layer, endogenic species, which live and feed in the mineral soil horizon, and enectic species, which burrow deeply but feed primarily on fresh surface litter. So I love this example, not because I'm particularly interested in worms, though I am now horrified to realize that worms are damaging the North American forests. But from just a language perspective, I really like how this information has been organized so effectively. And we see a lot of different components that are in place. So we have nouns, pronouns, verbs, more nouns, and punctuation. And altogether, this is holding a lot of information in balanced, in parallel. So we begin with sort of that grouping noun where it's referencing the species of the worm that's being referenced. So we have 3 species that are indicated. And then we have a pronoun, which is introduced after that comma to sort of signal to our reader that you're about to get more information about this type of species. So some of this information, it could have been organized differently. It could have been placed in parentheses, similar to our previous example. But here, because the language is being used very effectively, we don't need that punctuation to group the information. So the extra information is being communicated through both verbs and additional nouns. So we have live and feed, and then burrow and feed. And there is a slight disruption in that final example. And I think that's done very intentionally because if we put that example in between the 2 live and feed examples, it would have been a little bit more distracting. But having it at the end of the list when things are going to change slightly is a very smart choice because the reading experience is not disrupted. And then again, we have that reference to location. So the litter layer, the mineral soil horizon, and lastly, the fresh surface litter. And then each sort of description is being segmented using the punctuation of a semicolon in order to just group this information more effectively so we're not getting confused by which detail relates to which species of worm. So this is a really great example of how you can take really complex information, but through parallel structures, present it in a way that a reader is not going to get confused about what's being shared. So let's look at another example. Let's put our problem-solving hats on. Here we have an example of a sentence where something is a little wrong. Again, we're looking at another example of faulty parallelism. So what's the problem and how would you fix it? So feel free to indicate what you would change or even present a revised version of the sentence. It reads as follows. When we write plainly, unfamiliar words are replaced with familiar words. We reduce or eliminate jargon, and passive sentences are rewritten to be more active. So let's take 2 or 3 minutes and contribute in the chat. If you're still typing, feel free to continue typing away. I just wanted to comment on one of the remarks in the chat. So this notion of being like thrown off because part of the sentence seems that's written in a more active voice and part of it seems to be written in a more passive voice. And that's one of the reasons why we want to pay attention to parallelism as a strategy, as a tool that's available to us in writing, because we never want to confuse our reader. We really want them to focus on the ideas that we are sharing with them rather than rather to sort of stumble on how we've presented those ideas. And so that's always the message I come back to when talking about writing. It's always to try and ensure that readers are going to be able to focus on the message rather than become distracted by how the message is being communicated. So we have this example where, again, we have these the structure, it doesn't quite match because the first part and the third part, they seem to match, but then we have this disruption in the middle. So we have this sort of adjective noun pairing that we see twice, but then we have this like pronoun verb pairing, which is an issue. So once we've identified what the problem is, then we can think of different ways for how we might approach it and fix it. And I'm seeing actually different suggestions emerge in the chat. And again, we're just going to look at one possibility, but there are multiple possibilities that would be available to us. So in this example, we're going to really make use of our verbs. We're going to foreground our verbs in order to rewrite the sentence. So when we write plainly, we replace unfamiliar words with familiar words, reduce or eliminate jargon, and rewrite passive sentences to be more active. We have that option of removing the semicolons as suggested, or we could actually change this to have a slightly different style if we didn't want this more verb, this more active verb-centric style, shall we say. But this is one way of how we might revise this example. But I also want to bring to your attention another possibility that exists when you are presenting information in a parallel list, and that is the all-powerful bullet list. Now, depending on the context in which you are writing, a bulleted list may not be appropriate. It might not suit the nature of the genre in which you are writing, but it can be a very effective way if you are communicating information that needs to be organized as a list. So sometimes this more bulleted list is an option that's available to you, and it becomes especially important to be very cognizant of how that list is being written, because I think just visually readers are going to be more aware of how the first item in the list is going to be written. So you want to make sure that each item in the list is going to have a very, very similar and parallel structure. So we could take that information from the previous page and we could rewrite it as this list to write plainly, replace unfamiliar words with familiar words, reduce or eliminate jargon, rewrite passive sentences to be more active. The benefit to this as well, it's a little bit less wordy than writing it in prose, but again, the use of a bulleted list is going to be very dependent on context. So our takeaways, readers get distracted by faulty parallelism, but fortunately we can easily correct this. Once we develop our awareness of what faulty parallelism is, we can identify, okay, these are the elements that don't match, and so we can change them to match the other elements in our sentence. It's going to take a little bit of revising. Sometimes you might have to revise how everything is structured in order to force everything into a parallel structure, but often it is a more straightforward correction where there might just be one or two elements that have to be fixed to make them more appropriate. And one of the reasons why we love parallelism in writing is because of this sort of pleasing predictability for readers. And in doing so, it creates balance, improves rhythm, facilitates organization, and more. And lastly, it is a particularly useful strategy when creating complicated lists, whether this is in that extended prose or in a bulleted list. So these are all of the reasons why we want to be aware of how we can make use of parallelism in our writing. So we kept it under 30 minutes. Just a quick reminder of some of the different services and supports at the university library, everything from basic math and stats help to study skill support, research support, writing help, all of that and more is available at the library. Thanks again for joining me for today's Style Spotlight.
Thanks, Jill. That was fantastic. I'm going to stop the recording, and then if anyone has any questions, they can put them in now. Thanks.